Hello there everyone, welcome back to the class, both to new and long-time students and lovers of history. This History with Sire here today to discover to you some further parts now about the naval warfare during the French Wars. Again, this from the British perspective, and we're going to look at Horatio Nelson's key battles and what exactly happened in the 1790s and early 1800s in the naval situation. So if you haven't already, do make sure you've gone back and you checked out our first naval wars video. We went over the type of ships that were used, tactics, exactly how battle is fought among the Navy at this time, and a bit of background on who Nelson was, how he's a bit different to other British admirals of this era. With all that said, notepads and pens at the ready, and let us begin. So we're going to explore three major engagements today: Aboukir Bay, Copenhagen, and particularly the naval blockades that happened. Before we do that, it's very important to get a bit of background, a bit of information on what the situation was like by the time we get to 1798. So it's important to remember throughout the 1790s, as we've said, Britain is going to be committed to war against the French Republic. They are supporting other nations like Austria and Prussia who oppose what has happened to the French monarchy. Again, remember in February 1793, it is France who declares war on Britain. Why is it so important for the Navy? Well, it's the Navy's task to make sure not only does Britain stay safe through this era, also to engage and invade the French all over, particularly in the early 1790s. France is not actually fully under Republican control yet. There are still mutinies happening throughout all of it. There is still much rebellion, and therefore this is Britain's chance. They can try and get some headway into France in the early bit of the era. Then maybe they can stop the revolution before it truly takes over. And so this was the plan. So Britain's first major engagement under Admiral Hood in August 1793 was to take the French naval base of Toulon. Now this was the naval base for the Mediterranean. And so we believe they could take this area and they could of course massively halt the French fleet before it could even get out of port. However, the arrival of a French army forced Hood to abandon this port. Quite famously, artillery captain Napoleon Bonaparte was there, and this is one of his first major victories in the war to successfully force the British out. However, before being forced out, Admiral Hood made sure to follow something called scorched earth. If they couldn't have the French ships, then the French couldn't have them either. So he made sure to capture and even outright destroy a large number of them before having to leave. Some time passes until we get to Sir John Jervis, who in 1795 took over command in the Mediterranean, replacing Hood. Jervis, who loathed inefficiency, set about whipping the fleet into shape. He forged an excellent relationship with officers, especially Horatio Nelson, trusting them and advocating respect for them. However, the situation deteriorated for the British when in 1796 the Spanish, and the Netherlands to a lesser extent, decided to join the French against the British. The Royal Navy now had a big problem. They actually now had less ships than the combined fleets of the French, Spanish, and the Dutch, and therefore this seriously strained their position. The main British fleet was still stationed at Portsmouth, and therefore leaving just 15 battleships to form a blockade where double the number of French ships were preparing to break out. In fact, 44 French ships were intending to land troops in Ireland and launch a land invasion. However, fortunately for the British, this did not manifest because of a strong week of gales, and the French fleet abandoned this idea. Very quickly, though, into the following year, in February 1797, Jervis stationed the bulk of his force off of Cadiz, facing the main Spanish fleet. By February, Jervis's fleet now encountered this Spanish fleet that was twice the size of his own, and this created a decisive engagement known as the Battle of St. Vincent. It was here where he was confident in his skills that Jervis attacked and his ships cut through the enemy line. Nelson here also played a major role. Again, this is where he really begins to advocate his pell-mell style. Acting with speed and courage, he boarded and captured the much larger San Joseph and immediately became the darling of the Royal Navy for his actions. In fact, it actually stole the limelight from other commanders such as Tunbridge, Cuthbert Collingwood, and James Saumarez. Jervis had also managed to capture 4 ships, had drove the enemy back into Cadiz, and was ennobled the Earl of St. Vincent for his successful actions. However, despite their successes, things remained bleak for the British going into the rest of 1797. For instance, they still faced the big threat of a French invasion coming. They had a big issue where one of their allies, Austria, decided to make peace with the French that year, which meant Britain actually had no major ally left in Europe. Prussians had been defeated. Napoleon had also made some great gains into the Italian front. And therefore, the truth is that there was a large French army and fleet at Toulon that was preparing to sail, and therefore the British really were endangered here. The British now had a hard choice to make. If they sent their ships back to the Mediterranean to try and blockade the fleet at Toulon, they would therefore lose men in the Channel fleet, and therefore they would lose the strength there, and therefore, if they faced a northern land invasion for the French, they'd be quite vulnerable. And this is where Nelson comes to the fore. Nelson, with 3 ships of the line and 3 frigates, was sent to the Mediterranean to confront this Toulon fleet. And now we get to the Battle of the Nile in 1798. Now, what had happened here is that Napoleon had been ordered by the Directory, this is the government that is now in power in France, to leave Toulon with 13 battleships and 280 transports and head towards Egypt. There were some domestic reasons for this. There was some rivalry beginning between Napoleon's armies and, of course, the Directory, who was actually in power. And so many say that Napoleon was actually sent away to, of course, divert attention and try and maintain this power of the Directory. All in all, though, Napoleon is sent away, and of course he goes off to Egypt. Nelson was not caught off guard, though, and he sailed after Napoleon all the way to Egypt as well. He arrived at a place called Alexandria on June 29th. However, there was no sign of the French here, and so of course he went off to search elsewhere. However, the ironic thing was, just a few days later, on July 1st, Napoleon now reached Alexandria. It's quite ironic that because Nelson's fleet is so well trained and so fast, they actually beat Napoleon's fleet to the destination. By August 1st, though, Nelson had realized his error and he found the French fleet at Aboukir Bay, which is at the mouth of the River Nile, hence why this battle is called the Battle of the Nile. He found all 13 enemy battleships anchored in a line with both flanks close to the shoals. There's a big reason why the British had to be here that we have to be very, very aware of. And that is, if Alexandria fell and Egypt fell, then the British will lose their trading routes to the East India Company. So therefore, the British orders were clear. Prime Minister William Pitt ordered Sir Horatio Nelson to lead the British fleet and destroy the French. So therefore, Nelson decided to launch a direct attack on them in broad daylight. He slipped his ships through the anchored fleet and attacked them from both sides. He destroyed 13 13 of those battle fleet ships, and therefore there's only 4 ships left over. With many of the ships destroyed, this meant Napoleon's army was practically stranded in Egypt, and now, of course, this had reduced the size of the French navy quite decisively. For Nelson, he was welcomed home a hero and was made a baron for his successful actions, while France now had to find itself a new naval ally because it itself had now lost a lot of its naval fleet. The British government ensured they still kept funding the naval fleet, wanting to improve its capabilities during this war. This brings us to the second engagement, which is the Baltic threat that came from the Danish. By this point, Napoleon has made it back to France and he's now taken over as first consul and now become the leader of France. He's overthrown the Directory and now makes sure that his militaristic agenda of conquering Europe and conquering the world is going to become the number one thing that the foreign policy is going to be about. And so to do this, he of course needs a new naval ally, and so he chooses Denmark's navy to form an alliance with. He also, because of a few deals he arranges, managed to get Sweden, Russia, and even Prussia to form a League of Armed Neutrality, which therefore agrees that therefore they're not going to fight against each other, and if anything, their navies can now be used together. In theory, this gives France control of around 100 ships. Learning of this, now Vice Admiral Nelson with Admiral Parker were now sent to action to the Baltic Sea to attack the Danish city of Copenhagen. The idea was simple. They wanted the Danish to concede and therefore break their alliance with the French. If they would not, then they would destroy their fleet. The attack was truly an onslaught. And this was really brought about because Nelson was quite devious in an order. He was signalled by Admiral Parker to stop bombing the fleet, to stop bombing the city. However, by this point, as we established at Tenerife, Nelson had lost his eye, and so he later quipped that he could not see the signal in his telescope because he looked through it with his blind eye. Analysis proved, though, that this was indeed the correct move because it prevented the Danish from launching any surprise counterattacks if their navy had been left unruined. This actually, despite the destruction and of course the devastation for the civilian population in Copenhagen, only bolstered Nelson's image. And of course, this actually frustrated Napoleon further. He'd been trying to get a naval ally, and now failed to do so, and because of that, remained navally inferior to the British. And the third naval engagement we should be aware of is the blockades that are attempted from 1803 onwards. Now, by this time, Napoleon had assembled his army at Boulogne in northern France. He wanted to invade Britain himself once more. However, the British Navy patrolled the Channel extensively, and this made it very much impossible, if anything, foolish, to try and engage the British Navy at this time. Nelson also took to blockading the French ports in the Atlantic and Mediterranean. He did not want the French to have any advantage over him. So, because of this, Napoleon put a new order in place. He wanted his admirals, especially French naval commander Pierre Villeneuve, to occupy the British fleet. And this is the key word here, occupy them. He wanted to lure them away from the Channel and therefore weaken the defences, make them more concerned about what the French fleet was going to do to their trading routes elsewhere in the world. Because of this, Nelson found himself near perpetually at sea, always having to move and keep the French at bay and keep them away from their trading routes. Napoleon, meanwhile, also formed a new naval alliance with the Spanish, managed to convince them to join his cause and therefore add their ships to the French to match the number of British ships. However, the idea of a French invasion onto Britain still remained very much lackluster. Villeneuve was still very much preoccupied with focusing on disrupting trading routes rather than actually fighting and launching a land invasion himself. So by January 1805, Villeneuve comes under extreme pressure from Napoleon. He wants him to break this stalemate, this stagnation they're facing. And so to do that, the French fleet decides to leave their port and sail away from the British blockade towards the West Indies. Britain believes that therefore their sugar trading routes are under attack, and so Nelson is sent out to pursue them. Nelson crosses the Channel in just 3 to 4 weeks, while Villeneuve had taken 5 to achieve the same distance. However, by the time he reaches the trading route, Villeneuve changes his direction and decides to flee back towards Europe, believing he can outrun the British and therefore strike while they are open. However, Collingwood is still stationed there, and therefore he comes to the defence on the British Channel and therefore halts the French and Spanish fleets moving north to try and attack. This forces them to go back to south, and this, in 1805, is where a decisive naval engagement will be met. The British move in, they blockade the French fleet, they blockade the Spanish in at the port of Cadiz. Nelson catches up, he arrives and joins the fleet as well, and now by the time we're in October, this decisive engagement, the Battle of Trafalgar, will very soon occur. What exactly is this battle? Well, that's what we're going to explore in our third video on this series, concerning the French War's naval engagements from the British perspective. I hope you found this video quite informative. Again, if you want to learn more about these battles in greater detail, do check out the further reading in the description box below. Make sure you comment, make sure you subscribe, make sure you like. Again, your engagement is always appreciated in these lessons that we have throughout this series. With all that said, this has been History with Sire. Thank you for listening.